After Effects processes layers, masks, effects, and transformations in a very specific order, which is referred to as the render order. If you understand the render order, you'll be able to create compositions that look as you intend, and you'll be better able to troubleshoot when you run into problems. Let's take a quick look at the render order. Here we have a timeline panel representation of a composition, and here the visual representation in the composition panel. When After Effects renders the composition, it starts from the bottommost layer, in this case, the logo. It processes the masks, effects, and transformations on this layer. Then it moves up to the next layer and processes the masks, effects, and transformations on this layer. And when it gets that result, it composites it on top of the result that it got from the bottom layer. Then After Effects goes up to this layer, processes it, and composites that result on top of the result that it got from the previous operation. However, when After Effects got to this layer, it had to do something special. Because the source of this layer is itself a composition, After Effects had to go inside, as we will do by double-clicking, and process this composition, again, from bottom to top, compositing one layer on top of the other, and then when it was done, coming back out to the main composition, processing the masks, effects, and transformations on this pre-composition layer, and then using that result to then composite on top of the result from the underlying layers. Let's focus on the order of operations within the can layer here. Within the can layer, masks are processed first, then effects, then transformations. Let's see what this means. I'll draw a very simple mask on this can. I'll just draw a rectangular mask that cuts it down the center. Then I'll apply an effect, drop shadow, drag it onto the layer, and make the distance rather large so we can really see the result. And here we see that the result of the drop shadow effect is taking the mask into consideration. So the order of operations goes masks, then effects. Now, within the effects, if we have multiple, they're processed from top to bottom. Let's have a look. I'll add the linear wipe effect. And it's beneath the drop shadow effect. I'll drag the transition completion and change the rotation. So now you'll see that the drop shadow and the linear wipe affect one another. It goes drop shadow, so it draws the drop shadow first, and then the linear wipe is processed. If the linear wipe were processed first, then this drop shadow would be cut in half. We can make that happen by dragging the linear wipe above the drop shadow. There, now it's linear wipe is processed first, which cuts the can in half from top to bottom, and then the drop shadow operates on that. So we get this drop shadow. Then the next thing that happens is that transformations are applied. Transformations include changes in position, scale, and rotation. So if we press R to expose the rotation property here for the can, and then drag the rotation property to change it, we see that the unit of the mask and the drop shadow rotate together as one about the anchor point in the center of the can. If this isn't what we want, we can use the transform effect. The transform effect allows you to apply transformations within the stack of effects. So if I put the transform effect up here at the top and change the rotation property here, that transforms the can before the linear wipe and drop shadow are applied. So here is changing the rotation within the transform effect. And here is changing rotation in the main transform properties. So if you need to apply transformations before effects are applied, use the transform effect. Now we've been looking at this can layer, which is based on a .psd file. It's a bitmap or raster image. Now let's look at something that's processed a bit differently, which is the logo layer. The logo layer is continuously rasterized, as you can see from this sun-shaped icon. Let's move it out a little bit more to the center so we can really see it. And let's do much the same thing to this that we did to the can layer. We'll start by applying a drop shadow. And move the distance out. So far, so good. Now, watch what happens when I press R for rotation and rotate this. Notice that changing the rotation in the main transform properties is rotating the image before the drop shadow is applied. For contrast, let's look again at what happens when I do the same thing to the can, where the whole thing is moved as a unit. So, that's one very important difference between continuously rasterized layers and layers that aren't continuously rasterized. Now, I'll apply a mask, making sure that I have the logo layer selected. I'll draw a mask on it. And here, we see that just as with this layer, the mask is processed first, then the effects. So, the primary difference is where the transformations are applied. In the case of the can, which is not continuously rasterized, effects are applied, then transformations. Whereas with the continuously rasterized logo layer, transformations are applied, then effects. Let's see how the bat layer works, which remember has as its source a precomposition. We'll apply the drop shadow to it, increase the distance, draw a mask, and expose the rotation property by pressing R. Notice that this is behaving in just the same way as the can layer did. So this precomposition layer is behaving just the same as a non-continuously rasterized layer. Now I'm going to click this button for collapse transformations. Now I'll drag back and forth on the rotation property. Notice that once I've collapsed transformations, the bat layer is operating the same as the logo layer did. Collapsing transformations is not the same thing as continuous rasterization, but you can see now why they share the same switch, because they have the same result on the render order. So to reiterate, with non-continuously rasterized layers that do not have collapse transformations, the order is masks, effects, transformations, and with layers with collapse transformations and layers that are continuously rasterized, it's masks, transformations, effects. And if you need to insert a transformation within the layer stack, remember to use the transform effect.